These athletes put their lives on the line for our entertainment. They put their bodies through a meat grinder. And at the end of the day, most of them do uneven make enough to pay rent in the city that they are refighting in. So let me ask you this. Is fighter pay fair? Now, before we get into it, if you like controversial combat sports videos, make sure you subscribe because there will be one every single week. You may have heard recently that the UFC is worth about $7 billion. And yeah, Dana White and the Fertitas have done a really good job with the company since they took over. And the company has grown exponentially under their leadership. Now, no one is denying that the company is successful and growing and doing all the right things financially, but how much money the actual fighters get is becoming more and more of an issue. Are the fighters being fairly compensated for the risk that they take when they step into the octagon? That's the question that we're here to discuss today. Now, Dana White and the Fertitas say that they already pay their fighters well and that the fighters are all multi-millionaires after signing their new media deal. But many current and former fighters say that it's not true at all and that the UFC is exploiting its athletes. The UFC's total revenue from 2019 to 2021 was $840 million. Now, do you know how much the fighters got paid during that time span? It was only 10% of the overall revenue. In 2021 alone, the UFC made $463 million, and the fighters only got paid $51 million. How does that compare to other major American sports leagues, you might ask? Well, in the NBA, players get paid about 50% of the revenue. In the NFL, it's 47%. Even in professional boxing, fighters get paid about 35% of the revenue. So why is the UFC paying their athletes only 10%? Now, the argument could be made that those other sports leagues are more popular than the UFC and bring in way more revenue, but that wasn't always the case. From 2010 to 2014, the UFC was actually losing money. Yet the Fertitas and the Zuffa LLC were still taking home tens of millions of dollars every year. Now, the Fertitas said that they do and take a salary from the UFC and instead take a percentage of the profits. But back in 2018, Lorenzo Fertitta was actually named CEO of the company, and his annual salary was listed as $500,000. So I don't think he's completely doing it for the love of the game. So based on the fact that the UFC is making so much money, but the fighters are still getting paid next to nothing, it makes you wonder if the UFC is taking advantage of the fighters. After all, these guys are putting their lives on the line and risking serious injury and even death every time they step into the cage. In December of 2021, Ben Askren was fighting Demian Maia in a super fight at the Singapore Indoor Stadium. In the first round of the fight, Askren was knocked out cold by a flying knee. Now, do you remember this fight? Probably not. In fact, probably no one remembers this fight. But the UFC sold the pay-per-view for $30 a pop and made millions off the event. And where was Askren's knockout bonus for the fight? You guessed it, there wasn't one. According to reports, Askren walked away from the event with just $120,000 for his first round KO. That's less than what a guy like Cyril Gane makes for a win on Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. Now, you might think that Askren's making way too much money for a guy that only fought once in 3 years, but that's what he was getting paid for being a part of the roster. And hey, the dude literally got knocked out cold. Can you imagine if a baseball player hit a grand slam home run in the bottom of the ninth, and he did and even get a base bonus in his contract? Yeah, it doesn't seem right. Here's another example. Former heavyweight champion Junior Dos Santos was paid $250,000 for his last fight against veteran striker Tai Tuivasa. Dos Santos lost the fight via knockout in the third round. Former UFC fighter Mike Jackson was fighting on the prelims of UFC 223 in Brooklyn. Jackson was fighting a top prospect in the UFC, Kevin Lee. Now, during the fight, Jackson was getting dominated. I mean, the guy was having absolutely no success in the stand-up and was getting taken down at will. At one point in the second round, Lee attempted an illegal knee to a downed opponent. Referee Mark Goddard immediately jumped in and stopped the fight, giving Jackson the win. If you didn't see it, look it up. It was a pretty crazy finish to the fight. However, Jackson still only made $12,000 for the victory. So keep in mind, this guy had to endure a legal knee, strikes, and a beating for nearly 2 rounds to make $12,000. And it's not just the big names and former champions getting screwed. Some of the new fighters coming into the UFC, are also getting paid extremely low amounts. Sean Brady, who's undefeated at 15-0, is set to fight in the UFC for the first time in March. He was reportedly offered $12,000 for the fight. Now, literally, the UFC was offering him minimum wage to step into the cage for the first time. To make matters worse, the promotion expected him to travel all the way to Abu Dhabi and spend 10 days in a hotel quarantine before the event. So essentially, the UFC was going to pay this undefeated prospect $12,000 to go to Abu Dhabi and hang out in a hotel room for 2 weeks. It's not a secret that some of the best fighters in the world are making minimum wage or close to it. Fighters like Brian Ortega, Ryan Bader, Diego Sanchez, Holly Holm, Ben Rothwell, Cub Swanson, Paul Craig, Johnny Walker, Nick Lentz, Tom Aspinall, and many others are currently making between $12,000 and $20,000 per fight. Now, do you think it's fair that these guys are making less than what an average fry cook makes per month? And according to a report by ESPN, the UFC's contracted fighters have been protesting low pay for months by refusing to sign new contracts. Apparently, some fighters have refused to re-sign until they can get a guarantee of six-figure pay, and others are simply letting their existing deals expire and then waiting to see what happens. Fighters aren't allowed to unionize, which would allow them to collectively bargain for better pay and working conditions. And the Labor Department's National Labor Relations Board has ruled that mixed martial artists are not employees of the UFC. Even though they require drug testing, background checks, and they dictate how fighters conduct themselves in public. The NLRB says that because they're self-employed contractors, which means they're responsible for their own taxes, they're not eligible to join a union. This is obviously ridiculous. These guys work for the UFC. They're not independent contractors. And I'm sure everyone would agree that they should have the right to unionize. Now, just like any other business, the UFC says that they'll pay their employees more when they start bringing in more revenue. But until then, these fighters are risking their lives for pennies on the dollar. But what do you think? Do you think fighter pay is fair? Comment that down below. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a video.